joy to have you on. I will let you kind of introduce yourself first, just because I know you could probably do it better than myself.
Happy to do that. Should I go now?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm a neuroscientist, largely interested in kind of consciousness. In my experimental work as a scientist, I kind of look at perception and memory, but I'm also interested kind of theoretically in issues like around emergence of consciousness, which I think is a kind of feature of the life process. So I think it exists outside of brains in all living systems. And one of my biggest interests is kind of reconciling science and spirituality. So states of consciousness in which people feel their sense of separateness from the rest of existence is a kind of illusion, and that they feel a kind of a sense of liberation from suffering as they are reunited with their kind of identity as part of the whole unfolding of existence. Those things I think fit perfectly with science, and I'd like to see them understood and appreciated and part of mainstream culture, rather than something that's kind of sidelined and seen as kind of strange and not real.
Awesome. Yeah. And that kind of centers around the subjective experience of each individual being the hard problem, I guess. And that's kind of what led me to your work. Was the hard problem became a very interesting phenomena to me, just as far as why is it that I can perceive something and interpret it separate from another individual. And that became an unanswerable enigma to me, that led me to your work. And what I wanted to ask you about in regard to what you just said, also, is your living mirror theory, and the idea that basically once an organism separates itself with a membrane or something of that nature from its environment and begins interacting with it, that kind of initiates the conscious process. Is that kind of how that goes, or am I a little bit off on that?
No. So I would say it's really the So a living system, it seems necessarily, as all living systems that exist form this kind of three-dimensionally enclosed structure. It seems that that's necessary to resist the kind of disorder that comes with the second law of thermodynamics, just the general trend towards disarray that exists in our universe. And I think there's, I offer the kind of living mirror theory as very much as a scientific theory. I'm not kind of trying to claim that there's like a philosophical proof that it has to be this way or anything like that. Yeah, and it's saying, okay, here's the theory. What if the dynamics of that process is what brings into existence consciousness? It's in order to anticipate and respond and predict what's going on in your environment and yourself and how you're going to react, you need to build up models of the world. And here is where we would want to be kind of precise, because if this thing that's being brought into existence is consciousness, then I'm going to have to define it more scientifically. So, you have to be precise. And the words I use the word belief, which I mean in a kind of, not as in like, I believe that today is Wednesday, not that kind of linguistic belief that you can say is true or false, but just in the way that when I see an apple in front of me and I want to eat it, even if I'm not thinking verbally, I believe that apple exists. I'm holding an attitude towards this thing that I think is out there in the world. So I use the phrase holding that the world is a certain way. I don't think people that doesn't tend to click with people, it seems. But to me, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying like a living system, it holds that the world is a certain way. A rock doesn't hold that the world is a certain way. It just exists, but a living system does. And this can be you can see this in the thermodynamics. And so I think there's a good mathematical basis for believing this. So in this picture, again, it's a scientific proposal rather than a philosophical one, I would say, because it doesn't really deal with the I think the way to get around the hard problem is kind of to sidestep if you think that consciousness and matter are two substances, then you're going to have a really hard time. How does this substance of consciousness get created? I don't view it that way. I don't think matter or mind. I don't like thinking in terms of substances in general. I don't think a substance is something that kind of exists in it, from its own side. When you leave the room, it's still there. I don't really think matter or mind are like that. I feel like existence is this strange process, and so the best we can do is come up with maps of it. And my theory is a map of saying, okay, I think these systems are conscious, and I think we have a good, intelligible reason to think they are, but it never explains away the phenomenon of consciousness. I think a lot of the problem with the way people think about consciousness is that with everything else, they're under the illusion that the maps are the territory. So when we have particle physics, they think that the world is really made up of quarks and bosons and all these other things, rather than appreciating the world is unnameable. It's just it just exists. And then we have these maps that help us to kind of navigate it. But they don't, there's this illusion that no, we've explained it away. It's just all these particles that we've named. So with consciousness, suddenly we're like, well, okay, well, if we have an explanation, we should kind of explain it away. It should seem like a magic trick and I've understood how it's done. But it's not like that. We genuinely exist and we're experiencing existence, and it's awe-inspiring, which brings us into the kind of spiritual experience thing. And a map of consciousness should be a kind of humble thing, I think. It should be a simple theory of saying, well, here's what systems are conscious and here's which ones aren't, and here's why. In the same way that we understand water flows because of the kind of molecular and atomic dynamics between the molecules and atoms, you get an intuitive explanation as to why water flows. I think it's a similar thing with consciousness.
Yeah, and that's kind of the analogy you use for water flowing as the molecules essentially tumbling over. And that makes sense coherently to understand. That's why water flows, is the mechanisms and the laws of physics allow water to flow in that manner. And so what's interesting to me is basically the anti-entropy aspect of it, where something is self-organizing in a way that's creating a more complex, more integrated system over time. And that's kind of what your theory gets at, because that's a kind of incredible phenomena to see an organism separate itself from the environment, then interact with it and exchange gases with it, and then arrange itself in a way that's actually creating more complexity over time, which you don't really see, like you said, in rocks and non-animate objects. You don't see a self-organization towards a common goal. Whereas with prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, you're seeing a cell really trying to find a way to become more evolved, to find a way to basically organize itself in a way where it can perceive the environment more complex. And that seems to be in defiance of the second law of thermodynamics, which I know is kind of what your theory gets at.
Well, so I don't think it defies it from my perspective. So I think there's a kind of a lawful process of the unfolding of the universe seems to be along this trajectory from order to disorder. You could say, that's the second law. And then within that, the way that I understand islands of order that are living systems is that there is a lot of order in the beginning to be borrowed. So we can be made up of that order. We're not creating new order. We're just kind of borrowing that order when we eat food, or so if you take the sun that's highly ordered, and there's free energy that is released as it goes from the kind of the hot sun to the cold space around. And then all life on Earth, all the plants, all the photosynthesis is taking that order, making it into kind of bodily order of the vegetables and things that we might then eat. And then, so the order is being passed around. And then also the reason complex islands of order like ourselves can exist seems to be this, and this is very recent work in the last few decades in thermodynamics, it seems to be that the second law, it permits islands of order to exist where they take part in the disorder creating process more efficiently. So you could say we are machines that kind of make more disorder. So if you just let the mechanism of the universe run down, the disorder will be created at a certain point. But like water flowing over a landscape, if it's a steep bit, it will flow down more quickly. We, by chewing an apple and destroying it and then breaking it down chemically, I'm contributing to the rundown of the universe from order to disorder. So it seems that that's why these things can exist. So my pitch is very kind of naturalistic. It's just this unfolding. There's really no goal or purpose, no teleology. Do you have a different kind of overall picture?
Actually, I'm kind of developing my overall picture right now as we speak and as I've looked into it, because I just became fascinated with it inadvertently, really, and it led me to really prying into this in a lot of different ways. And it led me to your theory and looking at it, and it really just struck me so incredibly of a self-organizing system. And it seemed like Aristotle and Plato, and looking at those older writings, those gentlemen kind of assume the world to have a form and a function. And it, depending on how you take something and turn it into a form, it becomes different. And that, to me, seems like when a tree grows and it self-organizes into a tree, what is it striving for, kind of? Why is it growing upwards? Why is it organizing in that fractal pattern kind of thing? because that seems to be against entropy. It seems, but like you said, it makes sense to me that it's an interacting system with the sun, with basically with rain. You're a closed system, so you can have increases in complexity simultaneous with disorder increasing too in the overall.
Yeah, so I think it doesn't violate the second law, but I'm interested in the I think the intuition that when you, as you say, when you see a tree growing this fractal pattern, it does clash with our felt intuition as to what science is telling us, and I think that's not to do so much with the actual laws, but it's to do with the, the scientific mainstream has been caught up with a kind of anti-spiritual bent, I would say, where it's the kind, I don't know if it's just a sociological effect, where the kind of people who are interested in coming up with maps of the world are often people who are, for example, if someone experiences adversity and trauma, they can get kind of closed off and retreat into their minds, and maybe those are, on average, maybe more of those people end up playing with conceptual maps and they end up in science, and so science becomes this kind of this dry thing about just making, it's just to do with making maps and living in abstraction rather than really feeling the felt thing of existence. And so when you see that tree, to me, what's going on there is we have this intuition that, well, science says the universe is just a mechanism. It's just this, like, you can step back from it and you can look at it and it's a meaningless, purposeless kind of thing. And don't get overexcited because it's just, this meaningless, basically, toy that has no function. I kind of agree with all that on paper, but not with the feeling it imparts, because to me, we're in it, we are of it, and this is really happening. Existence is really happening, and we find ourselves. It seems we can only exist at in these areas of complexity, as you pointed to, kind of fractal patterns, and that's a relevant part, which is that where you get order and disorder. In between is where complexity lies. So there was some work done by the physicist Sean Carroll recently, basically arguing that where life emerges is like if you pour cream into coffee, you see all these amazing spiraling fractal dynamics. And so it's not that order is complex or that disorder is complex. They're both not very complex in different ways. But as you transition from order to disorder, you get this insane complexity. And so we exist, it seems, at that part, at the kind of the bleeding edge in between order and disorder. And so you get these fractal dynamics and all of this complexity. And it is just unfolding, and it's not, I don't think my perspective is, I think the coldness of science can actually be married quite nicely with a kind of non-attached, almost Buddhist kind of perspective, where you don't invest too much in grand narratives, because sometimes that can be a kind of imaginative exercise to escape your own emotions. And so it can be aligned that way, but there's this fundamental difference of saying the universe isn't just anything. We're not explaining anything away. We're not saying it's you can forget about it. It's this awe experience. The fact that we exist is something that's really significant and salient and worth noting and feeling into, rather than just trying to distance yourself from it with scientific models.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that, like you had said, the separation between science and having any intermingling with a metaphysical type perspective, that there's such a a big wall there that creates, like, panpsychism is kind of looked at as the redheaded stepchild of philosophy and science when it comes to the hard problem. And I'm not a proponent of panpsychism any more than anybody else, but it is an interesting thing that seems to encapsulate theoretically more how we see the world and understand it. But one thing I wanted to ask you about in regard to the hard problem is, I had read there was a professor at NYU, I believe it's Professor Ned Block is his name, and he was talking on hard problem, and he was saying how he polled his students and only 25% of his students even really grasped the idea of phenomenology. And I found that pretty incredible, really, because whenever you do try to, like this conversation you and I are having, when that conversation is had with most people, it stops very quickly because that phenomenology is not grasped or appreciated in a way that garners, like, intuition and inquiry further. They just kind of say, well, you see purple, I see purple, what's the big deal? And that's kind of like shuts you down, that the conversation ends there. And so I think it's I kind of wanted to get your opinion on, some people seem to stumble into this hard problem and really want to figure it out, and some just don't even care. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that people that do get attached to it, and there's people who just have no grasp of subjective experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think strangely, I think it's that when consciousness is functioning as it's intended to, that's actually when you don't become interested in it. So the philosopher Thomas Metzinger in particular has written about this idea of the contents of consciousness being transparent. So when I see that apple that I want to eat, what's really happening is there's a phenomenal experiential image, you could say, of an apple. And this organism is using that simulation of an outside world to then interact with this quantum buzz of whatever's out there that doesn't have an appearance, but we navigate in it, and then I can extract that energy and I can survive. And so in that situation, you think that you're seeing an objective world outside of you through the kind of clear lenses of, it's like your eyes are just these clear windows that you can see out of. And this is a philosophical position called naive realism, where you think, okay, the glass in front of me just exists, I'm seeing it effortlessly, and there's not really anything to be spoken about in terms of consciousness. In that situation, you're kind of like, what is consciousness? I see it, it's there. So then in different experiences, if someone takes a psychedelic, then is what Metzinger writes about, as you get a kind of melting of these different representations together, suddenly the contents of consciousness become opaque. You see them for what they are. You're no longer seeing through them like windows. You just say, oh, okay, my entire experience, my entire life has been in this space of consciousness. And so if you have any experience like that, you're more inclined to say, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, if I want to know anything about my existence and my situation, I've got to start to question, what is this space of consciousness? But yeah, if you don't have those experiences, then I can see why you would just go about your day, basically.
Oh, yes, okay. And that was kind of, it's not to say that people who don't grasp it are wrong. It was more or less what leads people to pursuing into it, because it is such a phenomenal problem, or not problem really, but question to ask. And it seems to come to those that engage in psychedelics or Eastern practices, something that brings down the level of self to where you feel self and other are kind of dissolved. And so it's kind of interesting to me that the separation, what brought me to it was the separation between non-living and living matter, and then trying to understand because when you have the origin of matter and then it develops into planetary bodies, where in that process does DNA arise as the instruction manual to self-organize? And so I wanted to see, since your living mirror theory kind of seems to be in this way, do you think potentially that DNA and its structure itself is where consciousness could be embodied? Because it seems like an instruction manual, and it can't really have an instruction manual unless you have time and consciousness first. So it seems like DNA may play, or RNA may play a role in this.
Yeah, so there's a debate about the origins of life, abiogenesis, and whether it's kind of replication first, like through a mechanism like DNA, or metabolism first, whether it's actually the cell wall structure and the behavior that comes first. There's always new evidence coming in, and this is a very murky area. We can't really go back and see what happened to the origins of life. But my instinct is metabolism, as in just the phenomenon of living, of adapting and keeping yourself going, of self-perpetuating. To me, that is the essence of life. And I can imagine a living system existing without DNA. I can imagine existing, it's an active process of being a living system. It's a kind of hurricane of, like a tornado that just keeps going and going and going. And in that process, I think DNA, these kind of long chain molecules, is a useful way to keep itself going. Replication is a very useful way to keep going.
Okay.
Especially if you, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I see what you're saying. Yeah, and so DNA is kind of emergent to that process, right, where you have disorder, like you were saying. I like how you captured it with there's order trending to disorder, but in that medium between that then and there, you have arrangements of complexity that seem like order, but they're merely facades of disorder increasing, essentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of saying it, because I think of them as order, but you're right that you could say that it's just a mask. It's a way that more rapidly producing disorder actually looks like something else. It looks like it's order, because permanence is an illusion. Impermanence seems to be, at all levels, seems to be a real fundamental aspect, both in the mind and in the material world. And so, yeah, if we think a living system is ordered in a way that has any permanence, then that's an illusion. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what goes back to what you were saying kind of on the Buddhist psychology of it. Buddhist,
Right.
of course, everything arises and dissipates. And I know kind of they get to that point with their self-transcendence and their meditations is kind of the goal is to cut that illusion out and to see the self for what it is as an illusion. And when you do that, you kind of you do have that transcendent experience, but at that point you either have to accept that loss of self as how, you know, you're almost meaningless essentially. That's how I felt. Not to get too autobiographical, but I was going through some Dzogchen practices and realized that whenever you do see that self-transcendence outside of psychedelics and in a regular mind state, there's really not a way to integrate that into the world in a way that you can it just seems kind of the Buddhists stop right there where, okay, it arises and it goes away and impermanence is a fact of the world, but we still have to exist in it. So it's almost like we have to make our permanence for ourselves or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about the equal importance of what you could call the absolute perspective and the relative perspective. So, in absolute terms, there's just one existence that's unfolding, and nothing is truly separate from it. But then, as we engage in this process of kind of attempted separation as living systems, we become very concerned with our relative differentiation. You know, I'm this, I'm not the environment, I'm not you. And so, to me, the aim of kind of any spiritual practice is not to transcend, not to get into the absolute and just live there, because there's really nothing to be done there. It's just being. So it's to know it's there, to be able to navigate towards it, and then to live life in light of it. So you would always come back to where you are, but hopefully transformed in a fundamental way where you feel more existentially grounded. You know, you can be born and then you're conceptualizing, you're living your life, you're building narratives, and you may have no idea what's going on. You may just you've never thought about consciousness, or, you know, you're not interested in science, and you're just lost. You don't know when you're thinking, you've never meditated, you don't know if you're lost when you're lost in thought. And then if you drill down and you find what's at the kind of basic level of just bare awareness of existence, that person will then come back and they can go on living their life in exactly the same way, but hopefully transformed, where they now feel they have some intuitive sense of what's going on, that they are part of this unfolding. It's all okay because the self is a secondary phenomenon. The psychological self is not the be all and end all. So their anxiety around death doesn't have to rule them. They can really feel like after their personal death that they will still exist in some sense if they identify with just the fact of existence. All of these amazing kind of liberating insights one can have, I think they're to be had, and then to come back and live more wisely at the kind of relative level.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I agree 100%. And I was mentioning that kind of just because I know there's a big trend in vogue is mindfulness, and the practice of mindfulness can lead to that experience. And without proper framing of it, it seemed to be, it could be a little bit off-putting to some. And so I think your work is really good because the way you describe your psychedelic experiences and the way that you relate subjectively to others, it helps reintegrate that experience into reality instead of being, because it seems like it could go one way or the other. You could detach from reality, knowing that and staying in that being, like you were talking about, and be in a monastery or something, or you could integrate it into a way of showing empathy and basically those abstract emotional qualities that aren't really explainable. Those increase, at least for me. And I know you had mentioned, just briefly, I wanted to ask you about, you had mentioned one of your videos I had watched about trauma essentially being in the collective unconscious, like collective trauma being shared amongst everyone. And then whenever you do psychedelics, you kind of see how you could feel the empathy of the whole world. And you have to learn that if you're overly empathetic, that's bad, and become self-aware enough to stand up for yourself and not be super agreeable, but you can realize the potential to take on the suffering of all of humanity. And that's a really cool take that I heard you say, where that psychedelic experience brings you to the edge of that and says, oh, wow, I can feel the suffering of the whole world if I need to, but I can't handle it on my own shoulders. And so you have to learn from that experience to, wow, I'm one with other, but I also have to be one with self in a way that allows me to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe this is what people refer to as kind of paradox traditionally in spiritual traditions. But to me, I never like the word paradox because it sounds kind of like it's a contradiction, even though it's not really intended that way. But to me, the wisdom always comes when you realize the two poles and how to live in the middle in a kind of healthy balance. And there's before we engage in any of this kind of work, usually we're thinking in terms of concepts. Concepts are intended to kind of give an illusion of permanence, and we say, okay, the world is this way. This is good. That's bad. And then, I mean, take something, a really simple philosophical problem. Most of us live most of our lives thinking something like killing is always bad. That seems like an easy kind of ethical problem. And then it's very quickly, you can pose people different questions around mercy killing and all, these other issues. And, if someone wanted to commit suicide, if they were in the worst imaginable situation, like I'm sure everyone could be given an example where they actually say, okay, in that situation, not so much. Like I think that could be the ethical choice. So the answer is always somewhere in the middle. These concepts like killing is always bad is clumsy and overly rigid. And so to learn to feel your way into the kind of space in between these two poles, whether it's, one extreme, you've got pathological kind of sense of isolation of like narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy, and it's all about me and my ego and screw everyone else, and you're hostile to the world. At the other end, you be kind of people-pleasing, self-negating, people might take advantage of you, and you end up in a situation where no good is coming of it. And so the answer is to find the middle ground. And then, with psychedelics, I think they really help people often open up into this direction. And if they're not careful, they could think, well, I've seen the truth that I am part of, I'm you and you're me, and we're all part of the same unfolding. So therefore I need to have this boundless empathy. But then to realize, well, again, that would be the perspective of just trying to get into the absolute, try to get enlightened and say, there we go, that will be my finishing line. And instead saying, okay, well, my circumstances, I am this separate living system. I do need to look out for myself as well. So finding that balance is always the answer.
Yeah. And psychedelics allow one that's overly agreeable to become a little more conscientious about other people's interactions with them. At least for myself, I knew I was a super agreeable person. And after meditating in psychedelics and having a little bit more of an experience of the ego being an illusion, it allowed me to be less empathetic in a way that empathy wasn't being a bad attribute of my personality, essentially.
Right.
Balancing that out.
Yeah, I think learning to set boundaries is a crucial psychodynamic process that we're never consciously taught in our culture, it seems, but learning to kind of feel out that right balance. And so the process I was talking about really comes down to boundaries of saying, in certain circumstances, I'm going to, I'm going to erect walls and say, like, no, this is where my limit is. But there's an interesting, like, with someone who's antisocial, usually they have very aggressive boundaries, and they might just say things have to be done my way, and if not, screw you. And so to me, the answer is always to have boundaries with a doorway at some point in there, where it's like you can be approached, but it has to be on certain terms that are respectful. And so when we're not consciously setting boundaries, we tend to be kind of lost in whatever our coping mechanisms are for the stress of, we're born kicking and screaming into this world as these vulnerable organisms, and that's a very shocking, experience to go through. And then we're incredibly vulnerable for a long time. And in that process, we all learn certain coping mechanisms. Maybe it's to be aggressive, maybe it's to kind of people please, and then we've lost a kind of, I think in mainstream culture, we've lost the wisdom or the practices, rites of passage, for example, that would help us to leave behind habits that no longer serve us. And instead we end up carrying these things with us. And so I think psychedelics, as they allow us to kind of change our brains and our minds and adapt, they're a really powerful tool to see this stuff and find a healthier balance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And speaking to that, what you had said earlier in that statement, I think it was Sam Harris or some philosopher of mine, kind of like him, who said something about separating the observer from what you're observing in such a way that self becomes so separate from other that you don't see your interactions with the world as having an impact, essentially. So if you're basically looking through the microscope of the world, and you're looking through, if that microscope doesn't collapse the wave function, or it doesn't have an impact on what you're looking at. And so to me, separating the observer from what's observed that just increases your egoic mind, because you start seeing other as a combative opponent to your success, essentially. Well, I've got to climb the pyramid, Maslow's pyramid, and I got to be accepted at the top to get to actualization. And in that process, you're having to overtly separate self from other. And so you just get more conceited towards that goal. almost, where actualization doesn't ever occur because you're stymieing it with the wrong pathway to actualization.
Right. Yeah, that would be a kind of a neurotic dead end, I think. Whereas, there's a lot about our circumstance that we find ourselves in that's incredibly fortuitous, and one of those is that the process of self-actualization, is not one of competitive rivalry where it's winner takes all and it's my positive feeling versus yours. We're with these incredibly social primates, they're deeply interconnected, and so mutual interdependence really is a process that's kind of necessary to get to real high levels of actualization. So we find that as we I am convinced that we won't see significant, there's a huge amount of suffering in the way that society currently operates, and I would like to see that change. And I don't think it will change unless we get a lot of people's kind of software in their minds running a different program and going from this kind of being lost in their own traumas and reactive dynamics through to having this process of actualization where they realize their interdependence on others. And then I think changing external structures kind of begins with this inner work. Because we're so interconnected.
Absolutely. And I think that, like you said, psychedelics leads to realizing the myth of, and this is another quote from Sam Harris, but the myth of the self-made man, essentially that no matter how self-made you are, you're never self-made all the way, because your environment put in place catalysts for your development in some way or another, whether it was having the resources to go to a college here or there or whatever. You didn't invent the resource that got you to that college, so the self-made mentality that kind of exists in capitalistic societies, especially like in the US, it promotes self so much too. And this is an abstract thought I have, but it seems to me that capitalistic societies that are pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality does nothing but increase the self-made mentality, increase the ego. And it's really hard as a society, if you're increasing the thought of ego in your inner workings of your economy, then you can't really change the individual until you change that, if that makes sense.
Right.
Until you change the structure.
I would agree with that as well. I think that's the one of the hardest things to face it. So, these things are always going to be kind of feedback loops. So that's a really great point, because to say that we have to start with the mind is really, that's not how it will work. Because if you have we currently have a system that pushes people. So the picture I was drawing of people being kind of lost in their own issues, all of these issues, because we're these living systems that are trying to stop ourselves from dying. Stress is a really fundamental kind of signal we use to navigate life, but stress becomes trauma when it doesn't become resolved. If we're not grounded and we can't kind of complete the loop of becoming activated in some way and then come back to being to feeling safe, then we don't complete that loop. And so we have a system that basically puts an enormous amount of stress on people to get basic necessities for life. And so stress and trauma are kind of part of the system. And no matter how much I might say, okay, well, if we have a cultural change, the more people are engaged in healing work, and I mean, this is what I'd like to see, as psychedelics become more mainstream, that people are more on board with this kind of way of seeing things, and they're healing psychologically, that will have its own pace. But the pace at which the current system is creating trauma and is pushing in the opposite direction is like a freight train out of control. And we see that with destructing the environment as well. So there does have to be material change at the same time. Otherwise, it's just going to be, trying to put out a raging fire with a tiny teacup of water.
Exactly. Yeah. But still, like you were saying, the sovereignty of the individual and their mind being corrected has to accompany it. So both have to kind of occur simultaneously. Right. And the individual action that you can take with yourself is something actually practical. I mean, looking at reforming the actual economic system in our governments is not super practical as a solution, right. And so I understand that, but overall it does, like you said, it does need to be probably paired with that.
Exactly. I mean, that's partly why I focus on the psychological side. I mean, partly because my background is kind of neuroscience and psychology, but also that, most projects, well, maybe that's not true. I was going to say most projects to transform society have been kind of economical, about economics. But actually, if you go back, I'm pretty sure, people like Jesus and the Buddha were trying to change society. And I guess I'm trying to kind of advocate that there was a reason they did that through inner transformation as well. So if someone thinks, I think if you implement a new economic system and you don't heal people, you don't help people to come out of their trauma and their reactivity, then you see the kind of horrors that we see in the 20th century, where you can have all your revolutions, but then watch as the most kind of psychopathic individuals take power and turn it into kind of a horror show. So I think that's something that needs to be widely understood, because if there are people out there who think we can just tweak economics without deep social psychological change, I think that's a dangerous avenue to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's no way you could change the collective without starting with the individual. So I guess that's a good point, that if you're going to change the economic society to mesh with a more self and a less egoic mind, you have to start with the individual mind and collectively change that. So I guess it kind of is bi-directional in that relationship.
Yeah, I think also because, like, to me, so there's this degrowth movement around kind of climate change in particular, of basically saying that the growth incentive of basically every industrial society to expand and kind of conquer more of nature, and that is the core insanity that's destroying the planet. And people in this camp are arguing that no matter what else we do, if we don't address this kind of exponential growth imperative, we're not going to be able to stop climate change. And I've been pretty convinced by their work. And so to me, shifting society to a situation where we're actually happy with a more subsistence level of, everyone's got food and shelter and basic kind of things, but we're no longer a consumerist society. We're no longer expecting gadgets and things, but instead we find, all the cliches of the best things in life are free. These are cliches because they're true, that if you lived in a peaceful community in nature with deep, close friendships, where you spend all your time, eating good food out in the natural world and playing music and creating art with people and engaging in intellectual discussions, to me, that sounds like a much better, much more enjoyable situation to live than living with gadgets. And if it saves the planet as well, then, all the better. So, but who's going to sign up for that without everyone becoming a little bit more like a kind of like a hippie, you could say, someone who's interested in meditation or sees the value in this kind of simple way of living? And you can't force it on people. That would be a kind of a terrible way to do it. So we really need, if we're going to have mass support behind something like that, we need psychological change as well. Because as you say, you can't kind of force it on people. Yeah,
and like you said, you can't force psychedelics on people, of course. But one interesting facet of psychedelics is, I know you had a video kind of on why does LSD make hippies. But the thing is it does have a connotation associated with it of laziness, of non-productivity, of, okay, we're going to just walk hand in hand into the abyss of bliss, forever. And the thing is that's just not true overall, because you've seen some of the most transformational processes occur out of psychedelics. And so I think it is important that the narrative of psychedelics not be this Timothy Leary high priest of LSD image, so much so as it should be. This is an intellectual pursuit that can eradicate 90% of psychological treatment right now, essentially. Maybe. I mean, that's I'm speaking out of turn there, but it seems like they're very impactful potentially, and in a way that you can even cease to use them without withdrawal if they're not dependent. And so it almost seems as if they're not something that you're seeking more of after doing one time. You're simply seeking life after that in a way that replicates that experience.
Right. And I mean, also with, speaking to kind of sustainability and if you're talking about psilocybin, they don't require a kind of the huge kind of pharmaceutical infrastructure that we currently have. People can grow their own mushrooms very quickly. The spores, can be produced basically cost-free. Well, not quite cost-free, but you can have systems that are incredibly effective. And so it seems such if you're in this perspective, it seems such a no-brainer that this is the way to go. As you say, I'm sure it could remove vast amounts of the machinery of the kind of pharmaceutical industry as people address their issues through psychological, emotional empowerment rather than addressing symptoms. But then, of course, we're back to the economics of it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. That was just my personal experience. Was I did ketamine treatment and went through that, and the process was incredibly transformative and very, very beneficial to me, unlike any, I would classify it as the most incredible experience I've ever had, whatever that means. But anyways, what it did was it allowed me to see all the reasoning for the constant personality I had. Basically, I had this personality that I acted in a way and interacted with self and other, never thinking about why I was doing what I was doing. I was just mirroring what I was shown, and all that suppressed trauma that you mentioned quite frequently. And when you're talking about your ayahuasca experience and kind of your upbringing, those traumas, you may not even know they're there. And so without the psychedelic experience, if you have experienced those intense traumatic things, you may never be freed from its grasp if you don't have this experience, kind of seems to me. And I don't want to paint a picture that life has to be dependent on an external substance to find actualization. But for some people, the way society is structured is it generates a personality, and there's no way to get rid of it unless you can see through it at some point.
Right. I mean, and also, the flexibility and the sense of self that arises with these kinds of experiences, you could question the idea that these are external in any meaningful sense. That if you see yourself as part of nature, in the same way that for me to be healthy, I need to interact with other humans. Interacting with these plants and fungi seems like just a part of life. Humans have been doing this for as long as they've been human. It seems, well, as far as we know, we don't really know that.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think it's I think we're unnecessarily cutting ourselves off from part of our engagement as an ecological being that exists in these ecologies, because we want to stand apart from nature, right? So we think we don't need these things, but it's not so much about needing them, but just existing as a healthy part of the ecosystem, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to me that basically humans, as they interact with their environment over time and they develop relationships with other, you can either progress in the direction of becoming more self-absorbed, seeing yourself as an opponent to the world, or you could see it as, like you were saying, symbiosis, essentially, where you do see fungi interacting with trees and transporting nutrients and interacting symbiotically and mutualistically. And that's an integral relationship to the tree's survival. The tree doesn't even exist if it can't use that fungi to transport necessary nutrients to some of its progeny. And it even seems to me like some trees will pick out their progeny and send extra nutrients to them, their offspring. So trees kind of have a little bit of a cerebral system that exists utilizing a relationship integrally with fungi. And so it's not that you have to be dependent on it, but trees and nature seems to have to form those symbioses to exist in general. And we deny that we need that at all. It seems like psychedelics help us see, once again, we have to encompass other and self. Whereas if you don't, you think, well, I'm self-made and everything, but there's no self-made, and that's a dangerous precipice to kind of start tumbling down, because you can quickly just devolve to narcissism and treat others as if your interaction with them isn't going to make them go and have a terrible day after you talk to them negatively.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's, to me, thinking about concepts is really useful. So conceptual thinking, as I said before, is kind of rigid thinking. It's saying, I am a self. I'm an island. I have a boundary around me. Like I'm going to draw a border around me conceptually and say, like, this is James and that's it. Whereas actually the reality is interdependence. There are no, as I said, in the absolute perspective, there's just this interdependent web of existence. And so, physics shows us this as well. It's this single unit of unfolding. And so we're fooling ourselves if we invest in stories of rigidity and permanence. And you're right, like the self-made person is a perfect example of that. It's really the most, if I'm to account for what's happened in my life, the most accurate thing I could say is that there's a kind of lawful causal unfolding of events, my genetics and my upbringing and my things I've been exposed to. And I am this instance of this causal unfolding. And so that in that picture, there's nothing at all to be attributed to James as like a virtue or a vice, or it just is in the same way that a tree grows the way it grows. There's a spiritual teacher called Ramdas who used to say this thing about practicing turning people into trees, because he says, if a tree's a bit bent, you understand, okay, well, the sun was over there and it got bent because it was growing towards it, but you don't judge it. And he said with humans, we really discriminate and judge and say, well, you really shouldn't be like that, rather than understanding why they are like that. And so it's not to say, on the absolute level, there's always understanding to be had, that things are always a way for a certain reason. And then what we need to understand is that when we do discriminate, when we do say, well, stay away from that guy because he did this to me, and those kinds of things are kind of maps, they're relative kind of conceptual landscapes we use to navigate the world. And so it's one thing to say, if I say that guy's bad, what that means is that I'm offering you advice as to how to kind of protect your own boundaries and navigate through the world. But what I'm not saying is that in his essence, inside, he is a bad person. No one is there. First off, there is no self that could be a permanent thing that could be good or bad anyway. And so it's the same thing as mistaking your concept for reality. At the start, I was saying we mistake concepts in physics for subatomic particles, and we think they are the reality, but they're not. Reality is beyond words. It's just this awe-inspiring unfolding, and then we need to really be aware of the place of our concepts, that they're just these symbols, these maps that we use to navigate the world.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And going and speaking to your basically how we want to see subatomic particles and how they evolve and how they get larger and how gravity coalesces matter into planetary bodies. And then we have abiogenesis, kind of like we talked about earlier. All of that process is what it is, but it seems dualistic in its nature as far as how it's, like you just said, it's defined Einstein or Newton or whomever on the planetary side, but the inverse square law applies to how gravity works. That applies to large, massive bodies. But those theories always break down at that particle subatomic level. It seems like they're incoherent when they merge. And it may seem to me that and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, maybe there's not a merging of quantum and large planetary systems in a mathematical manner. And we have to accept that there's a duality there. There's a duality of subatomic interaction with the uncertainty principle there. And then we have large bodies that are particles that we can determine their movements from. But if we can't ever accept that, hey, they may never merge, then we're stuck trying to merge something that's immergible almost.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that idea. If I had to put money on it, I would bet that eventually we'll come up with some way to link them, but I don't think that's a guarantee. I think, again, coming back to understanding that these are just maps, that we have one game we play for describing what's going to happen to particles, we have another game we play when it comes to describing large bodies, and maybe those are just two different stories that don't link up really. They don't. Again, I think there may be a way to bridge them, but I mean, I don't know what the answer is. But
yeah, exactly. It's hard to bridge those kinds of things. I mean, it's almost, and trying to bridge them, if there isn't a bridge there that can be made, then it can be a lot of wasted time almost. We're looking into every subatomic elementary particle using the Hadron Collider, and we're trying to find this, that, and the other. Well, once we find it, what do we do? I mean, what are we garnering from that introspection? Is it simply because we've already went so far down the rabbit hole that we have to keep pursuing physics in this way? Because if we do, we have to renounce all the work that's been done and say, okay, these don't merge, general relativity works, and we don't know why.
Right. I mean, I wonder if there's, it could be a case of kind of genuine emergence where if you were like, okay, I have my molecular story as to what James is as an organism, I can describe all the molecules that make him up. And then I have my large scale kind of physiology story or say my body plan, like why I have two arms and my eyes are on the front of my head. And if in this analogy, you want to link those two and you want to have a single unitive theory, that's not really the way to approach it. There are appropriate maps of those two scales, but you're not really going to come up with a good explanation. I mean, this is maybe a bad example because you could talk developmentally about kind of DNA, but if you wanted to just stick to talking about the carbon atoms in my skin and those things and get an explanation of why my eyes are in the front of my head, you're not going to do it because they're just different maps. So I think that could be the case, but yeah.
I see. And I know you had a Neil Seth on one time on your podcast, and I read his book, which I really enjoy his perspective, of course. Very fascinating work that he's doing, and I think very important because of trying to establish some kind of measurement of consciousness to where we can treat brain dead people or loss of consciousness type of patients better, more compassionately by knowing their level of consciousness, which before it seemed like anesthesiologists were going off of a kind of a guess or an estimate as to if this patient conscious, and you would have like a waking anesthesia where you would have somebody aware but unable to move and things like that. And Neil Seth kind of said about the brain being a prediction machine. basically where it predicts the world for us, and it's just simply a computer. And he thinks that as he probes into this easy problem, the hard problem will either answer itself or be a non-issue. What's your thoughts on the hard problem being kind of just diminishing as we pursue the easy problem?
Yeah, so I'm not convinced by that, because you could always say, if you have a complete understanding of the brain, in terms of its kind of functionality, if you were to make a brain in a machine, or say if you were just to code up some software, you could never say if that software was conscious or not. If you had no theoretical stance on consciousness, if you were just like, okay, I've got all my theories of how light is transduced in the retina and all this stuff happens, with those kinds of descriptions you can come up with scientifically, you're never going to, without taking that leap and saying, here's my stance on consciousness, you're not going to be able to say. So that's what I'm kind of trying to offer with the living mirror theory, is to say, we know that human organisms with brains are conscious, and my background is neuroscience, and I spent many years baffled by the hard problem, but it was mainly, what it felt to me was that my bafflement was coming because I'd been trained in a tradition where, as you say, the brain is seen as a computer, and so you're running this software in the brain, and so somehow that software just suddenly becomes consciousness, and that's the leap that people seem, I think rightly think that can't be done. You can't just go from, because information processing is this kind of abstraction in a way. And so it's hard to imagine how that becomes the lived experience of genuine existence. And then the thing that kind of clicked for me was realizing, well, it's the embodied act of being alive. Consciousness is this feeling, this way that we feel our way around the world. So you could say as simple as that all living things have to feel their way around the world, and feeling is consciousness. It's not, it's the same thing. You can't feel if you don't have consciousness. So that, I think you need to take a philosophical, I guess. So I guess now I am saying my maybe not philosophical, a theoretical stance on consciousness. And then you will never have proof of it. But to me, I went from feeling like I was really scratching my head and like, how will this ever be answered, to feeling like, you know what, I think this perspective makes sense. It doesn't prove anything philosophically, but you look at it from a certain perspective, from the way I'm looking at it, it all seems to line up and make sense to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I that's what really strikes me as novel about your contribution, especially to consciousness and your living mirror theory, that I really find very intriguing, is just that the idea of self-organization to more complex. I know that we were talking about entropy, and it does, and your explanation makes perfect sense, that it fits in with thermodynamics, but it's still novel that things are organizing upwards to a more increased, where you have a central nervous system, a lymphatic system, and they're all operating. I mean, that is still fascinating, that disorder, and amidst disorder, that would be the way it manifests.
Right.
And the way that I was looking at it in your living mirror theory is basically, as you start interacting with the environment, I was thinking in my head, potentially that creates the idea of time. I don't know if this is kind of a philosophical in-depth thing I was thinking on, and looking into it, I was like, okay, if everything's energy and mass, basically from Einstein's equation, speed of light's integral to that theory, and that's a measurement of meters per second. And so to introduce time would be introducing light per meters per second, essentially, to that equation. You can't really analyze time until you have an interaction with your environment. So once an organism starts sharing gases and defecating and doing things like that and reproducing with its environment, inevitably time has to arise, because you're trying to get somewhere. You're trying to increase something by exchanging things. And then at that point, you have reference of time, which could possibly embody consciousness, maybe.
Yeah, I think if you separate time in a physical sense from time in a psychological sense, I think you're totally right that I think change, if we use that word, is fundamental in our existence. Probably maybe the most fundamental thing is that things are in flux, things are changing. And so the speed of light, you could understand in a stepwise way, it's changing. And if you extrapolate over time, okay, it looks like it has a miles per hour speed, but we're kind of abstracting that. But there's just this change. And then it's when minds come into existence through the life process that we start to string these moments of change together and say, okay, I'm now abstracting that there's a direction here, and I can abstract that there was a past, a thing I can call a past, where this present was in a different state. and I can abstract into the future. And then we tend to live in this way where we think this linear time is really real, but actually I think there's just this kind of flux of the present moment.
Yeah, and that's an interesting phenomena too to consider as being in space and time, being at your X and Y coordinate being 1 and 2 or something, but your time, you're still progressing in the dimension of time regardless. But you're still just present. Basically, the past was already the present, the future is going to be the present. And so the more you interact with the present, instead of trying to fixate on the future, which never turns out the way you would probably simulate in your mind, you can actually exist outside of it, like a time dilated way, which is maybe why psychedelics and things do affect time, is because consciousness and time perception are integrally maybe related. What's your thoughts on time and consciousness?
Yeah, no, I basically agree with what you're saying, that I think it's the psychological kind of aspect of time is a mental construct. And so when you dismantle that construct, you're left with a feeling of eternity. The present moment feels like it opens up into this eternal space, and that often goes along with, you also lose the construct that you are a self that, you know, will exist for a certain period of time, and you instead identify with just bare existence. And so you also fall into an eternalism of realizing that you as existence will always exist, because non-existence isn't possible. So you don't think this through logically like that, but there's just this awe-inspiring realization of this eternal being, which is powerful. You know, that seems to be at the core of these experiences that cure people's fear of death when they're dying of cancer, right, in the psychedelic studies. So it's an important thing that we need to get out there, I think, as something that's not supernatural or inexplicable, or something that fits with science, but it's just a wonderful thing to be discovered.
Exactly, and to leave a little bit of it into the realm of unknown, and appreciate that maybe we won't know something. We may not know the hard problem, but if we can accept that, we can really drill into it further without having so much concern on, is this going to solve the hard problem? We can actually start accepting, hey, maybe our thought level doesn't advance beyond the idea of thought. So pursuing the hard problem can stymie research maybe in a way that's not productive as it could be. We say, okay, we're subjectively having an experience. We don't know why. Now let's figure out the things between there and here in a way that, like you said, psychedelics and meditation and Eastern practices. And it seems to me like the Vedic sciences, science in quotations, but those are kind of like manuals to consciousness that are out, that people wrote 5,000 years ago. Like when you read the Bhagavad Gita, you feel like you're reading metaphysics from Aristotle or something. You feel like this is right. You know, you feel like, wow, these people knew something back then 5,000 years ago about consciousness. They really did. They knew there was this Brahman or whatever. It just seems almost like the Bhagavad Gita was a pseudo metaphysical science that somebody kind of captured these ideas a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, they say that, right, that they were
sciences.
They were like consuming soma, right? This substance,
yes.
So it seems very likely that, you know, on the banks of the Indus River, something interesting was happening, maybe involving a psychedelic. But yeah, I mean, they had all the tools that we have when it comes to introspection. You know, science has not given us new tools of introspection. So there's nothing, and they were fully modern Homo sapiens like we are. So it totally makes sense that their insights would be as valid as ours.
Exactly, yeah, and you had Brian Morescu on one of your podcasts, and that was really fascinating. Hearing his dissertation on just going, I forget the school, the new school archaeology, basically that's looking into that kind of basically old artifacts, cups, chalices, and looking at their composition and seeing, does this have ergot in it or whatnot. But his propositions on the sacrament in Christianity being psychedelic, or the Eleusinian mysteries being something of a psychedelic coming of age for a person, those traditions, like you were saying earlier, those might have been psychedelic and super integral to creating people like Plato, Socrates. Those guys may never existed without the mysteries. And if the mysteries were psychedelics, this could have been something that's almost required of our human existence to partake in at some point.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Eleusinian mysteries, like, you just read the descriptions of the experiences that people had, and to me it's case closed that it's, you know, whatever word you want to use, psychoactive, entheogenic, like, they're telling us that it was. You know, if someone says, oh, I consumed a substance and it gave me these experiences, then yeah, you almost don't really have to do any other work. Alcohol that time, you know, you couldn't brew it to be, you know, alcohol wouldn't give you these experiences anyway. So it seems pretty clear to me. And yeah, Brian's work is great. I think
Yeah, it is.
Most people tend to kind of, I think, try to, dismiss it as just kind of fanciful. But yeah, I mean, to me, it just makes complete sense. And
Yeah.
I think there's a reason that fermented drinks have been so integral to kind of Western spiritual traditions, from Judaism to Christianity. Drinking wine in prehistoric Neolithic religions, it seems that beer brewing was really important. And if you are living close to nature and you know all the properties of the different plants, potions are a thing that existed that we don't really have today. But clearly, people had a mastery of the natural world and were mixing things together and producing interesting substances. And yeah, now we have the archaeological evidence as well.
Yeah, and that was really fascinating. Brian's work is really neat. Just like yourself, that was a really fascinating conversation. And I find it interesting too, kind of that the oracles and things like that in ancient Greece, the shamans spoke very language that's very close to how we speak on psychedelic experiences today. So
Right.
like basically, and so they were administering their way, and they were going, like you had explained in your ayahuasca experience, how critical it was that shaman sang to you at that exact moment the song that really helped ground you back and integrate better. The shaman had a role of a physician in that sense back then. And it was, like you said, it was really captivating to hear your personal experience of how, it wasn't just the taking of the ayahuasca, but it was the coupling of the ceremony that you were talking. Whenever you realize, okay, my inner self is tormenting itself or existing, and you were able to put that to bed, it was kind of coupled with the shaman being there at the right time and administering the ceremony along with the substance with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to reflect on it 2 years later. This barely comes up anymore, it was so powerful that it feels like it happened to someone else. Basically, as you say, it really can put these issues to bed. And yeah, you're right that it was. I mean, for me, it was my first group psychedelic retreat, and that was a wonderful. At an extra interpersonal dimension. I'd done a lot of work solo, but then having other people, whether it's the shaman or the other people on retreats, was, most of, as I say, we're social animals, and a lot of our wounding often comes in interpersonal contexts. And so having safe, connected experiences with other people and psychedelics can be an incredibly kind of, powerful healing experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's so fascinating about it is the overwhelming virtuosity that kind of emerges on psychedelics, where, and briefly going back quickly to the dialogues between Socrates and things of that in Greece, they were probing the idea of, where does this virtue arise? Is it taught from student to teacher? Is it formal academia? Can I send my child to empathy school and teach them how to be empathetic? Like, they were really curious about, why do we choose to act in our own disinterest for others' interest if we're biologically oriented towards just survival of self? That would make no sense. And so it was kind of, back then, it was psychedelic in a sense. A conversation seemed psychedelic because they're probing, why do I love you? Because they're talking to each other. Why do I feel that? What is the grand goal? Where does this virtue arise? Can I teach it? Can it be remembered? Is it divine? That kind of subject matter. And it seems to me that psychedelics almost help you remember how to be virtuous, or remember that, oh, it's not just emotion and action. I can consciously will myself to be patient, to be kind. And as I do that, I can exist better in the present moment.
Right. I think this comes back to the conceptualizing issue, where I would say today and in the recent few millennia, we've had a very constricted sense of self. So it's not that it's normal to think the self is this body, but it's actually, that's a very constricted sense. So when we relax those concepts, we remember that actually we are embedded in a larger organism. We're like a cell in this larger human kind of community. And we function as part of, we make it up, and its movements affect us. And then we're embedded in this larger system of the earth and then the universe. And as you let go of your concepts, your sense of self expands until it's kind of not there anymore, and there's just being, and you are that. And so, yeah, I think and it brings us back to what we were talking about in terms of healthy boundaries. You just find what's the right level there. And I think for a lot of humans, it's like, there will be kind of nested hierarchies of, like, if it comes down to it, it is my responsibility to take care of myself. If I don't choose to pay more attention to my activity when I'm crossing the road. If I'm instead trying to coach someone on the other side of the street to help them cross the road, that's the kind of neurotic thing. And I walk out in front of traffic because I'm not paying attention. Like, then clearly I need to be a little bit more self-concerned. But then, having a sense where if there's a close friend and something befalls them, where you will help them unquestioningly because they're so connected to you that it's as if it's happening to you. That's a very healthy, nourishing way to be. It's also, I think our societies are deeply atomized and fragmented, and so it can be the project of a lifetime to really build those kinds of connections. But to me, there's nothing better to spend your time on while we're here, basically, in terms of, apart from self-actualizing.
Yeah, it's an examined life is, a non-examined life wouldn't be worth living kind of deal there, kind of sentiment. And it's not even a laborious or a tedious to really look into it or probe into it, because as you do, it's fascinating. And so it seems to me, I was very atheistic and militant atheist for a long time, and chose to make that my identity, kind of, where I can kind of shove it in your face. Hey, I know why your religion's wrong. I don't know why. That was kind of my personality, I guess. And it wasn't a good way of being in the world at all. And whenever I realized, okay, there's something to this realm, and I could stop being like that kind of egoic way of looking at other people, and you open your mind, you could start to dissolve that barrier between science and spirituality. It's almost like there's a required merging of those two in a metaphysical sense in order to progress past where we're at with science. Like, if we want to go further and want to look at the hard problem, we can't keep looking at it as the integrated information or the global workspace. We have to look at it kind of as you've proposed it, where it's emergent with interaction with the environment over time, kind of.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's a great point. So if you took my theory that I think consciousness is tied up with life, you could almost go two directions with it. So there's this school of philosophy, a perspective on consciousness called illusionism, where people kind of it's associated with Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish more recently, who argue basically that consciousness is an illusion. It's not really a thing that needs to be explained. It's just kind of, and it can be tricky to understand what's meant by an illusion. And most of the time when this is said, to me it sounds kind of absurd, because I'm like, consciousness is the one thing I know exists.
Yeah.
But actually, when I unpack what they mean, a lot of the time I'm like, I kind of agree with you in that I said at the start, I don't think consciousness is like a substance that needs to be accounted for. I think it's just, this is what it feels like to be and to hold beliefs about the world. And that's it. There is no extra thing. There's no magical extra thing kind of going on that needs to be accounted for. Now, the reason I'm not an illusionist is you could basically take that perspective where you're like, there is no extra magical thing that needs to be explained with consciousness. And the illusionist effectively says, if you accept that's our circumstance, they would basically say, okay, nothing to see here in terms of existence. It's just, naturalistic science is all unfolding, and it's just, this blind mechanism. You think you're having experiences, but you're not really. Whereas I go the route of, there is very much something to see here in terms of existence. Like, existence is awe-inspiring, and if you just confront it, there are experiences. The experience of just bare being is what people use the word spiritual to refer to. It's awe-inspiring, peak experience, amazing, whatever word you want to use. And so I think that's the piece that's missing, both from the illusionism, but also from mainstream conversations about consciousness. I don't think the spiritual experience thing is an extra additional thing to be explained. I think, so what I'm trying to do is basically say, here's a theory that, it's a humble scientific theory, a proposal as to what might be an intuitive story we can tell about where consciousness exists. It's not a metaphysical solution. And so it's just a humble scientific theory. And then if you come to me and you say, well, what about why hasn't it explained away my consciousness? Why? And then I would say, it's a map. It's not supposed to do that, but take note, this is what it feels like to exist. It's awe-inspiring. It's amazing. And you can have it just, it defies words. I'm going to start stumbling if I try to explain it more.
Absolutely. And the awe-inspiring is something to be even probed a little further, because just the emotional feeling of awe, like when you approach the rim of the Grand Canyon or something along those lines, I had built it up, and in my head I was like, there's no way I'm going to arrive at the Grand Canyon and be too amazed, because I've seen so many pictures, so many movies. I'm like, it's going to be underwhelming just because I've seen it so many times. And then I arrive, and that overwhelming awe overwhelms you, and that right there in itself is crux of it to me is an emotion like awe that can arise, that if you really metacognitively feel it and look at it, you're like, what is this feeling? It almost feels anxiety mixed with excitement. It's
Right.
almost a reconfiguration of anxiety into something positive, but you can't reconfigure anxiety purely physicalism. Physicalism would say you have this one part of the brain and that makes anxiety occur when it activates. Well, not if anxiety can manifest 8 different ways and different parts of the brain are creating the same. So awe in itself to me seemed, like you were saying, that gets at the crux of consciousness not being an illusion, because that's like one of the purest emotions that really doesn't have an evolutionary backing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these feelings that seem to be at the base of our minds, by which I mean, many people have attested if you meditate, if you just pay attention, you stop thinking and being lost in thought, these are the kinds of experiences you have. To me, it seems like just the fact that we're these living systems that pull ourselves up by our bootstrap, and we live on a kind of knife edge. We're constantly swapping out our parts and keeping ourselves together and trying to get food and doing all this stuff. And
Yeah.
we're very small in comparison to the vast universe. And I think in that situation, there is a thrilling, almost overwhelming existential, it's an intense existential circumstance to find yourself in, constantly trying to stop yourself from falling apart. And that's the basis of all stress and trauma, and every other fear is based on that fear of death, basically. But on the other hand, if you are in a flow state, and if you feel safe, and if you feel like you're safe enough, within that safety, it can be a feeling of exhilaration or all the things you were describing. So I think there can be a naturalistic account of it, but it doesn't explain it away or diminish it. It just means that, when people have these experiences, they can very quickly think, okay, there's some kind of loving cosmic consciousness at the root of the universe, because why, when I stop thinking, do I suddenly feel this amazing bliss and I feel so good to be alive? I think there are probably just quite straightforward biological reasons for that, but it's still I mentioned earlier, there's lots about circumstances fortuitous. I think that's one of them. It just turns out the structure of our minds is that you can be liberated from suffering. And at the end of the day, I think that's what all of us want.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good way of phrasing it. Is it's almost like whenever you can cease to think, or you can lower the level of communicate, because it seems to me like the default mode network in the brain that kind of creates an overactive self, at least at what I've read and understand. That's kind of an interhemispherical connective pathway, kind of where the left and right can talk to each other and the hindbrain can be a little bit more active. So you're kind of merging emotion with yourself all the time, and time traveling backwards and trying to mind wander all the time. And that it's almost as if that default mode network's a negative aspect. It's overactive by our culture, or something along the lines of where we've created this overarching sense of self. It's not intuitive to develop that. It's like babies and things like that aren't born with this overt sense of me and other, and we're going to have this separate theories of mind. But so it's almost like society or culture incorporates that, and then we almost have to reconfigure ourselves to make sure, because society's conditioned us and coached us the wrong way. Almost the mental structure of how we get to actualization leaves so much potential unactualized.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. The self is a very flexible concept, but most of us don't realize that. We're just pushed into the most minimal, constricted version there is, and there's lots of good work to be done to undo that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. And one last thing, I know I kept you a little long. It's a little bit over an hour now, but I wanted to ask you, since you're looking at more of the interaction with the environment, a self-constructing complex organism kind of arranging itself over time, that interaction being the conscious element of it. Have you looked into or heard about kind of the idea of memory being formed in microtubules of the cytoskeleton in the neuron? I'm sure you have. I don't know much about it, but it seemed like when I read your stuff work, and I looked into your work a lot, I was like, this makes sense. And then I saw this theory. I was like, wow, this almost seems like yours, and that almost couples science and philosophy together to really make what you're saying work.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Roger Penrose's stuff around consciousness and microtubules, maybe.
Yes.
In that, there's, he's a very, highly respected physicist. But with the consciousness stuff, I've never seen it really as a solution. Every cell has microtubules, and they're largely thought to just be structural. I mean, given that every cell has them, and I think every living system, including cells, are conscious, I see what you're saying. That actually, he's basically, as I understand it, he's saying that, he's thinking computationally, and he's saying, I think that certain things he's saying consciousness can't be computed, but something about the kind of collapse of the wave function at the quantum level,
Yes.
quantum computation
Yes.
could kind of solve this issue, and microtubules are
Yes.
at the right scale that could happen.
Yes. That's what I
Which is
think. So
kind
I think
of,
that's how it is.
yeah. I think I don't necessarily think it needs to be explained at that kind of quantum level. I don't.
Yeah.
He's telling a story that I guess doesn't resonate with me, but I respect it
Yeah.
as like, he's a physicist who has a better grasp of the physics of this stuff. Um, but yeah, that's a good question. I'll read. I read his book Emperor's New Mind as a teenager. I'll go back and have a look at it again, I think.
Okay. Yeah. No, yeah. And that was kind of, I don't know. Obviously, it's very complex neuroscience and very complex particle physics. Essentially, you're
Right.
looking at uncertainty principle. You're looking at Schrodinger's cat kind of idea of in your brain, essentially consciousness arising when you mentally
Right.
collapse a quantum function.
Exactly.
Basically,
Yeah.
you're performing quantum computations at the atom level in the brain. And so it's very intriguing, but it kind of merged with just because it's interaction. And it wasn't even Roger Penrose. Actually, it was another gentleman. I'll send you a link to he's a physics
Great.
professor at Yale, and he actually went further than Roger Penrose on the philosophical side of this. And
Okay.
Roger was so much physical. And so I was like, wow, this gentleman, and the way he was explaining it made more sense to me. And then and then your theory, it's like, well, this kind of makes sense. This idea of looking at, okay, this is the science of it. This is the philosophy of how and why consciousness arises. This is where it's encoded in the neuron. It was kind of intriguing to me to see how, okay, well, it's unpredictable the way microtubules will send down the axon. The way that transmission occurs is unique in the way it goes almost every time. It's a unique combination. And so where does that uniqueness come from? Is that a conscious equivalent of conscious will occurring in the very synapse of the neuron potentially? And if it is, that kind of explains how we can mediate between future gratification and present acceptance and, kind of thing, where maybe the mediation of conscious will arises at that quantum level. And then it gets to the pyramidal neurons up there. And then at that point, you can actually will something into being or something along those lines.
Yeah, I'd love to read that. I've not, come across that. I mean, my stance on free will is kind of, you mentioned Sam Harris before, is kind of similar, probably the same as his, which, as I understand it, is effectively that both subjectively and objectively free will doesn't make much sense in terms of libertarian free will of like truly being able to, it comes back to the kind of self-made person, truly being able to do something unconstrained by circumstance seems to be a kind of fantasy. And there's just really a causal unfolding. And even if you introspect, there's not really any evidence of free will. Things just kind of enter into consciousness from a kind of mysterious background.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And that was something I was thinking about recently. When I watched your video, you kind of used that analogy of if somebody's at a fork in the road and there's a forest on fire to the left, and they can't really choose the left. It's not, they can't go in, that decision's almost not there. And it's a situation like that where your biological response to stimuli occurs prior to your conscious awareness.
Right.
But then whenever you look metacognitively and you start thinking, well, okay, I need to stop doing these behaviors now in order to do something better. And I found myself recently being able to do that in a way where I was like really upset at myself that I was having to say no to this, but I actually was cognitively aware of, wow, I'm saying no to the will because of the future. And before I was just whimsically kind of operating in the world. I was kind of like, well, I'm going to do this and who cares if I do that? It doesn't matter. Then I found myself, wow, I'm actually cognitively looking at this situation as I can't do this because I need this to happen in the future. And then you start realizing, wow, that's the nature of consciousness is, wow, I'm actually considering with reason, do I need to stop doing what I'm doing now? So in 2 years, things are better. Well, that's kind of the crux of humanity is where you can make that choice, but that's almost conscious will, and free will to me is something different. It's like, if you hear a loud noise and you jump away from it, that's not really under your control, but you can't apply that same logic maybe to complex cognitive thought to the point where it becomes nihilistic. We're like, oh, well, there's no free will, so I can just ruminate all day and things will fall in my lap type deal.
Yeah, really, it does really feel like we have kind of conscious choice, and there's something that goes on where we have autonomy to make decisions. But the consciousness part, I really feel consciousness is just a kind of passive witness that everything is kind of unfolding in a lawful way, and consciousness is just being observed in consciousness. So, when I think about free will, I especially, if you think of the entire population of the human race, to say there's free will would suggest that the people who are really suffering have kind of got to blame to some extent. Whereas I think there's just influence, really. There's just us having effects on each other. The reason I the main reason I speak kind of in public is because I hope to be a positive influence. I hope that talking about these things will land with people. Maybe someone will go meditate, maybe they'll become interested in psychedelic therapy, and I think this is the best thing we can do, is just, because I don't believe in free will, I think the more we talk about these things and we just spread positive, we try and elevate what's going on, bring people out of suffering and into healing and peace and collaboration. And it's going to go the way it's going to go. And I'm doing what I'm doing because of who I am and because of my history. So there's nobody home when it comes to a kind of conscious agent who's forcing things to happen. It's all just kind of lawfully unfolding.
Yeah, it's almost like insight and intuition that comes after meditating or psychedelic. That doesn't come from you, it's not this self that's just having these insights all of a sudden. And I agree with you. I think that free will as the element of it is an illusion, and the implications of that are so far reaching, even into like crime and punishment type philosophical approaches. Like, can you really punish someone for their actions if there's no free will? So you kind of run into some, but like you said, I don't like the word paradox either, because it's not a paradox, because inevitably it's how it works. And so it's merely a result of that. So I agree with you. And I think that when you look at free will as an illusion, in the sense of, okay, I can't go into the burning forest, because you can't, you just can't, you can't walk in there, because your biological instinct is to survive. And so your free will, even if you wanted to go into the fire, you couldn't do it, because your organism that's against that. And I think the analogy used in like the Vedic sciences for consciousness is, like you were saying, a witness, where they show a chariot. And I think one of their gods, Krishna or something like that, is operating the chariot, and the self is sitting behind him. The higher self is behind him in the chariot, watching him. And the reins that he's using to hold the horses is the mind, and the horses are the senses. Right. So it's kind of like an integrated mind, self, intellect, and personhood, all, and the consciousness sits in the background and watches the intellect battle the mind to control the senses, kind of analogy.
Right. Yeah. I definitely think of consciousness as this. It's far simpler than we might think, actually. It's just this witnessing. That fits with this kind of non-attached perspective, where you just let go into this non-dual realization that there's just this unfolding, and there are these different islands of witnessing. But when you do that, you feel completely at home in the universe, and that's the good news that's to be found at the bottom of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very freeing. I think it, like you said, I think it's it's very impactful what you're doing to try to make this public and all that. And I think there's something very freeing about understanding free will as an illusion. It's not this taking away of your individual sovereignty. It's not this violation of selfhood. It's an increase of individuation almost, because you're subjecting yourself and submitting to this causation, this ultimate cause of all causes kind of deal. And
you are the unfolding. You come to identify with the unfolding itself. So it's surrender into a greater sense of self, rather than there's this. If you identify as an ego, then you don't have any freedom. You don't have the freedom you want. But if you identify with everything, everything is unconstrained. It's just doing what it's doing. The universe is doing the thing that is most in its nature. That's kind of what it is to lawfully unfold. It's completely unconstrained and out of control in the most wonderful way. And if you identify with that, there's true freedom in the sense of liberation. Not in terms of I want to be free to choose this or that, but it's just complete liberation and openness and freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an incredible thing. And as I've looked into it and into the hard problem, I've really enjoyed the insights that come along with meditation, coupling it with the literature associated with it. There seems to be, if you read the right literature coupled with the right psychotechnic practices, and you do this with conscientiousness, you can get to conclusions that just don't seem to be your own, or things like, okay, I know this about the universe now. I know that consciousness permeates existence, and that the neural network in my head is simply perceiving it. Before that, I had this overt thought that consciousness was simply being aware that I would die one day, that I was a self that would pass away. And that was what I thought consciousness was. I never thought about it past, I'm aware that I exist kind of philosophy. And then to start realizing, consciousness is much more than being aware of my expiration date and acting in accordance with that. It's much more than that. It's the fact that I can enter this room and the whiteboard to me, elicits some type of emotional response separate from you. And that there is where it led. And I wanted to say that a lot of your dissertations and all of your talks you've done on your channel on psychedelics and your process going through that has been excellent and a helpful tool to me. because like I was telling you, I
Okay.
kind of went through the ketamine treatment and things like that. And the integration by the professionals wasn't really there. So I was relying on YouTube and books to help integrate this process without having a foreground. And you really, the way you describe it, the visceral nature of it, it's like I can vicariously integrate through your the way you explain your experiences. So I wanted to just say I really appreciate your candor whenever you made those videos, and the way you walk people through that process. It's very, very helpful.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you. There's no higher praise than hearing that I've actually helped with someone's kind of healing
Oh yeah,
process.
and a big, really a lot. I identify with your experiences, where you were at, why you felt the way you did, your ayahuasca kind of awakening type experience. I just identified with the foreground of it as far as the exposition, the background. I had the same type of experiences over and over again, it seemed like. And so I was able to intellectually understand it through your videos. And so I think that's an incredible thing that you're doing by making those. And so I wanted to just say that psychedelics have promise, and it's better off for people like you to be promoting them. So that's really great.
Yeah, thank you. That's great to hear, because it's against my culture as someone who's raised as a reserved English person to be very open on the internet about my deepest, most vulnerable kind of personal experiences. And so it's nice to get feedback that is helpful rather than just
and I could feel it
unnecessarily
too.
exposing.
Yeah, no, and I could feel kind of the anxiety that you probably had just, talking about that. But that even helped. That helped relate to it, because I was like, I would like to talk about this, but I'm seeing somebody really break out of it and say it.
We're all in a similar
so,
situations, facing the similar stuff.
Yeah, it was, and you could tell like it was very meaningful to you, but you were able to get through it and explain it in a way that was subjectively identical to mine. And so some of those things that I had found on YouTube, things that you said, your theories on consciousness, a lot of that stuff really helped integrate. I think the use of the internet and finding stuff that your work really helped me integrate all of this suffering that I didn't understand where the origin of it was. I knew I had agency in it, but wasn't 100% sure how much of that agency was mine. And so I introduced the psychedelics and meditation, and ceased the psychedelics and just pursued meditation, but didn't have the foreground by which to integrate all of these insights. And so I think it's incredible work. I know I've stated that 3 or 4 times, but it really is incredible
Nice
work.
To hear.
And I couldn't be more. I think that work like that is going to be, like you said, what starts changing at the individual level, the overall consciousness. So that's really cool. And I really found it very useful.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're lucky to live in a time with the internet and the kind of information technology we have to be able to spread tools of integration. I'm hoping that will make the difference this time with psychedelics hit the mainstream, that people will be able to integrate and have, really positive experiences rather than getting lost in, we spoke earlier about just entering in a more kind of dissolve it. We spoke earlier about Timothy Leary and then the kind of that way of thinking about psychedelics. And I think in the 50s, society in America was so rigid that the counterculture burst into the complete opposite of kind of complete chaos and disorder. There's an interesting process called schismogenesis in cultures, where neighboring cultures often define themselves as the complete opposite of their neighbors. So, I think there's 2 cultures in the Arctic where I think it's the Inuit and another culture where one uses kind of kayaks and the other one uses snowshoes, and they're both incredibly useful tools, but each culture refuses to use the other one. So the people who wear the snowshoes refuse to use the kayaks and vice versa. And you see this all over the world, where it's like we define ourselves by we don't do what they do. I almost wonder if in the 60s we saw that with psychedelics, that it was people wanted to be the complete opposite of the rigid culture they were raised in. So free love and chaos and disorder. But that's not going to produce. We need a balance of order and disorder. So I'm hoping with these kinds of conversations with information technology, I think there's a desire now to reach a synthesis. We live in a post-psychedelic, post-60s world now, and I think we're ready for a healthy synthesis of these 2 perspectives.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think the framing around it in the 60s too might not even have been so much free love and anti-work and devolving society as it was just propagated as it was that. I mean, in the US at least, Richard Nixon called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in the world, put him in prison multiple times. And when you have when you have a president who's violated the oath of the Constitution and been impeached, calling a psychedelic Harvard professor the most dangerous man in the world, you've got a really juxtaposition there. You've got something wrong. Your society's inverted, you know?
Right,
And so you don't
right.
know what the accounts of history are really, were they psychedelic gurus that were just all quitting and dropping out of society and ruining the world? Maybe not, but they definitely didn't want people thinking for themselves in a way that would, you know, lead them away from the material world. I know that there was a political urge, at least, to not have people engaging in things that got them to drop out of the world. I mean, the president, the way the U.S. was ran post-industrial revolution, wants nobody to individualize outside of climbing this
Right.
hierarchy. And so those, I could see psychedelics on a mass dosage or mass use in the US, making lots of people quit their, you know, go and do something more meaningful. And I don't think the
Right.
government wanted people to do that. So it could be that we have the same thing occur this time, but since we have people like you, people who are helping people integrate these experiences, they're not just dropping out and going and living in Woodstock. They're able to take them and still live in reality because of access to all of this information.
Right. No, I think you're totally right. Actually, that these structures are not. I think this time around, one of the biggest problems is going to be structures that don't want people to actually actualize themselves and empower themselves and live a sustainable life. You know, if enough Amazon workers stop working for Amazon and Jeff Bezos starts losing his work, losing his wealth, I'm sure his first thought will be, how do I reverse whatever process is happening so that I can keep having the power that I have? People don't like to lose power. I'm not casting aspersions on him in particular, but just using him as an example of people who are benefiting from the current system won't like it if radical change happens as a result of mass psychedelic use. So I think we'll face the same changes again, the same challenges again.
Yes, we will. Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of evolving, the psychedelic treatment becoming in the foreground, at least in the US, where ketamine's now commonly used. It seems like lots of ketamine treatment facilities, and now psilocybin, I think, is going to become, at least I know Johns Hopkins over there, the MAPS program, I believe, you know, they're getting it pushed through the FDA for psilocybin treatment. So I think that it's pretty novel, and I'm really hopeful that this clinical inpatient approach, I don't know if that's ever been done before, but if it's done right, I mean, and you actually have the inpatient psychoanalysis coupled with, instead of just, because what my experience with ketamine, the infusions I had, they threw me in the room, injected me with it, and left me in there. And so I was very disoriented and without direction.
Right.
So when I left, I just almost died, you know, and then I was exiting the facility and they were like, all right, you can call an Uber now. And I was just like, oh, do I just go back to living now?
Wow.
So I think that experience was really profound, and it changed my whole life. I mean, I don't mean that too lightly. It sounds kind of woo-woo, but it's not. But it wasn't because of the way that they integrated it for me. It was because of having to do a lot of work afterwards to make sense of this. Otherwise, I would have just been disposed to the whims of whatever it showed me. So I was kind of appalled by the lack of psychoanalysis that was done and the lack of trying to couple therapy with the infusions. But I think that's not super common. And so I think as long as they're not doing it super for profit and capitalistically, as long as you make sure that people are given proper integration, then this inpatient psychedelic thing seems super novel in the world, and it could be what changes. What are your thoughts on just inpatient psychedelic administration? That could be a really big game changer, right?
Yeah, I think it's in the beginning, we need, for the mainstream medical establishment, things like that, to have enough people, to plant enough seeds that then everyone has a cousin or an aunt or a father or a mother or someone they know who has benefited from psychedelic therapy. And then I think people will start to, I'm in favor of people, you know, being able to grow their own mushrooms, consume them themselves, create community centers and networks of support. I think networks are way more robust than these kind of rigid systems of you have to go to this particular specialist. And, you know, I think we can trust people to engage with these things wisely in a way where it becomes part of your ongoing journey as a person, rather than you thinking of yourself as someone with a mental health issue who needs treating. You're empowered to take this stuff into your own hands.
Absolutely. No, that's excellent point. And hearing your experience and everything, and you paralleling it to how it helped you your transformativeness as far as understanding trauma and where it originates, it made me realize that there's probably a lot of people out there who just don't know where the trauma comes from, and so their actions and their way of being in the world is dictated by something that they may not even know they need to look into. And so it's just it's overwhelmingly kind of compassionate. The fact, this whole idea of psychedelics, it's just
Right.
to me, it's just the fact that people are promoting them, the fact that people like you are trying to help people integrate them. It's just it's a human movement. It's very, very neat to watch unfold. People really caring about people suffering, people wanting to provide aid at a deep level of saying, look, society and your culture and your upbringing created your cognitive perception. Let's rewire that. And in kind of with neurogenesis and stuff like that they're saying with psilocybin, I mean, you're rewiring connections in the brain to form, to repair damage. And so the fact that the mind is dynamic and the brain can change with the mind like that kind of adds another element to consciousness, to where you see, okay, it can't be a physical, at least type physicalism, where it's this 1-to-1 ratio of mind to matter. But the fact that the brain can rewire itself and new neurons can grow, it means there's some intelligence there driving the mind and the brain together, which is kind of fascinating overall that it can do that.
Yeah, I think it's secondary to the life process. The life process always finds a way to keep going. And then
Yeah,
that's
true.
the origin, the engine of intelligence and everything else.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I think that your living mirror theory gets at the crux of the methodology. It just seemed to me, it seems like it makes sense once you start exchanging and interacting with the environment and reshuffling your interaction with the environment to more complexity. It almost has to be conscious then, because it's self-organized. So it may not, the hard problem, if we can accept that we don't know the answer to it, but we know that consciousness arises out of interaction with organism and environment, that kind of does explain it. At least it's all in my head. I was really stuck, and I was like, what am I going to find? I read all these theories, panpsychism, and then all the crazy theories out there, of consciousness, and then you finally find one that makes sense to you. And it kind of puts to bed a lot of those issues, where I would stay up and be like, what can I need to figure out tonight? What is this, And at least I was able to put to bed that overwhelming inquiry in my mind for now, and then look into Roger Penrose and that microtubules part of it. And it seemed like, wow, these guys are onto something over there at Oxford.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'm glad to know I'm not alone.
No, not at all. And I'm fascinated with that. And I also wanted to ask you about your Portugal project. I wanted to ask you if you wanted to describe that a little bit. I saw about it, but I didn't read too much, and what your goal with that is. Just at the end of this.
So we have a farm in the mountains of southern Portugal that we call the Surrender Homestead. And when I say we, it's me and my wife. And we're going to kind of be opening it as a retreat center, mainly for kind of meditation retreats. But generally, all of the things I talk about here, doing talks and workshops and stuff like that. COVID's made it kind of tricky. Everything's under construction at the moment. But I'm hoping, let's say by next year, we're doing this in early 2022. So 2023, hopefully people will be able to come regularly for retreats.
Wow, that's great. That's fascinating. Awesome. And what made you choose Portugal? Just curious. Is it you got ties there?
It's mainly, we wanted to be in Western Europe, ideally, and want to be somewhere with nice weather that people would want to come to. Awesome. Yeah, and then when you look, it's between places like Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal. Portugal just is a beautiful country. It's very cheap to live. Lots of cheap land. It's a hidden gem. It's not got the same kind of profile when it comes to tourism that other countries have, but it's as beautiful. All the medieval castle hilltop towns you'd expect to see in Europe, and especially the coastline. It's wonderful.
That's awesome. Yeah, that description just makes it seem like the perfect place for a retreat. So I think that's
great.
No, I think that's an excellent work. I hope to follow it. I'll follow it and see how it goes. But that is a great endeavor. I think the work you're doing is fascinating, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me today. It means the world to me. I really enjoyed it, and I think the work you're doing and the neuroscience of it and everything, it captivates me beyond and the visceral connection that I had with how you vicariously walked through your ayahuasca experiences. I know I said that earlier, but it does mean a lot to me. And I think that your work doesn't go unnoticed on not just intellectual level, but the emotional level too for people.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Yeah, it's been really, really great talking to you, Ethan. It's been an unusually far-ranging conversation, which I've loved. You may have seen in my work that I try to be unconstrained to talk about whatever I think is important. Yeah. And I've really enjoyed the kind of weaving in and out of loads of different topics.
Yeah, it's been kind of all over the place, but it kind of came back to a fabric of something at the end. But Yeah, I very much enjoyed it. That was comprehensive and just surface level, but I liked it. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can talk again soon.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it again, Dr. Cooke, and I will be talking to you soon. And thank you very much again for coming on. Your work is absolutely integral to the study of consciousness, I think. And I think it's something excellent.
Great. Thank you. That's great to hear.
Thank you, Dr. Cooke. Have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.